I almost walked past the sound. It was late morning in Forest Park on the edge of Portland, and I was out there to clear my head, not to bring home another problem with four paws. At first, it was just a thin, broken noise under the traffic hum. Easy to blame on a bird or a branch rubbing in the wind if you wanted an excuse. I wanted an excuse. Then a blind German Shepherd puppy stumbled out from behind a mossy log and went straight into the trunk like the world had no edges. He shook it off, blinked those cloudy eyes at nothing in particular, and tilted his head toward my footsteps as if sound was the only map he had left. Mud clung to his tiny legs, his fur was damp and cold-looking, and every little breath came out like he'd been running for miles with nowhere to arrive. I stopped in the middle of the trail and told myself to be smart, to keep moving, to let someone better suited find him. I've said that line before. It never sounds convincing, but it's good at buying a few seconds of cowardice. He sniffed the air, turned toward the noise of my boots, and walked right up until his nose bumped my laces like he'd been aiming at them all along. His tail gave one uncertain wag, not the happy slap kind you see in adoption videos, more like a quiet question. Are you mine or not? I felt that familiar drop in my stomach, the one that means if I reach down, my life gets heavier in ways you can't put on a scale. I crouched anyway, knees complaining, hand hovering over his head like I still had a choice. Up close, he smelled like wet leaves and fear and something stubborn that hadn't let him quit yet. The second my fingers brushed his ears, he leaned into the touch for half a heartbeat, then twisted away and pointed his nose back into the trees. When I tried to scoop him up, he pushed against my chest with all the strength he had, not to escape me, but to pull me off the safe gravel and into the undergrowth. It felt less like a rescue and more like an invitation to follow a dog who couldn't see. And I honestly wasn't sure which of us was making the bigger mistake. I hesitated because letting a dog who couldn't see lead the way sounded like the kind of bad idea I was usually smart enough to avoid. My knees complained when I crouched beside him, a reminder that I'm not 20 and not built for scrambling over wet roots anymore, but he leaned into my touch like I was already late. My name's Russell, I heard myself say, quietly, as if introductions mattered in the middle of a muddy park. He didn't care what I was called. To him, I was just hands that hadn't gone away and a voice that stayed put. His fur was colder than it should have been, damp at the base, ribs too easy to count under my fingers, the words rescued puppy forming silently in my throat before I could speak them. When I tried to scoop him up, he twisted in my arms, paws pushing against my chest, nose straining back toward the trees as if gravity had its own opinion. This wasn't the wild scramble of a dog trying to escape a stranger. It felt more like urgency, like he was late for something I didn't know about. Okay, I muttered, because arguing with a blind dog in public is a good way to get your picture on the internet. I slid a spare slip leash from my pocket, looped it gently around his neck, and loosened my grip so he could choose. He surged forward at once, dragging me off the gravel and into ferns that soaked my jeans, stumbling over roots, correcting himself, always facing the same direction. Branches scratched my jacket, mud sucked at my boots, and a small, doubtful part of me kept asking why I was trusting a guide who couldn't even see the ground. The rest of me just followed, because his certainty felt stronger than my excuses. He moved like this path belonged to him, as if every dip and stone had already been mapped in his head long before I showed up. Every few steps, his little body clipped a stump or slid in the slick leaves, and each time I braced for him to quit and curl in on himself. Instead, the brave pup shook off the impact with a quick snort, lifted his nose, and pulled harder, towing me deeper into the trees like a tiny, determined tugboat. We left the wide trail behind and traded it for a narrow track that smelled of wet earth, old leaves, and the faint, sour trace of forgotten trash. Once or twice I slowed, thinking about turning back, telling myself that at least I'd tried and someone else could finish the job. Each time the leash went tight and he paused, angling his head toward me as if asking, "You're still coming, right?" I heard my own voice filling the silence, telling him about the slope, about my lousy balance, about how ridiculous this all was. He didn't answer, of course. He just kept moving toward something only he seemed able to remember. The path dropped sharply, and I slipped, catching myself on a fallen trunk just as he barked, sharp and clear, nothing like the earlier broken cry. Ahead of us, a massive tree lay on its side, hollowed out by time, its open end facing us like a dark tunnel stuffed with old straw that had no business being in a city park. He dragged me right to that opening, claws scratching, then ducked inside without waiting to see if I followed. From the shadows came a cluster of tiny sounds, whimpers, sniffs, small paws shifting, that told me he hadn't brought me here for himself. For a second, I stayed kneeling outside the hollow, breathing hard, feeling like I'd crashed into someone else's secret. The straw inside was dry and clean, not the kind that drifts in on the wind, which meant someone had made a nest on purpose and then walked away. I sank onto my hands and knees, jeans soaking through in the cold dirt, and raised my phone to light the darkness. The beam slid along the curved interior and landed on a row of round faces pressed together, 6 pairs of eyes shining back at me like marbles lost in a cave. The blind little guide was tucked beside them, nosing each head in turn, breathing them in as if counting, before curling close with a long, shaky sigh. Every tiny stray puppy in that log shared the same smudged coloring, tan and charcoal blurred together like someone had painted them with one tired brush. They weren't skin and bones yet, but their bellies rumbled loud enough that I heard it over the faraway hum of the highway, and the air in there already felt cooler than it should. Leaving them wasn't an option, not with evening creeping closer and predators that didn't care about my internal debates. I backed out, wiped my palms on my eyes, and jabbed at my phone screen to call the little rescue I help on weekends. The words tumbled out of me. About the log, the straw, the blind leader who had dragged me straight to this hidden pile of siblings. On the other end, silence stretched, the kind that means someone is counting kennels in their head. "We're full," my contact said at last, tired and soft. "Maybe we can take 2, 3 if we're lucky." I stared back at the log in 7 expectant shapes and understood that the next move was mine, whether I wanted it or not. I sank back on my heels and let the forest quiet settle over us, the kind of stillness that makes every decision echo louder. 7 little bodies, 1 beat-up car, a small duplex with strict rules, and a man who had already promised himself he was done pushing his limits. The arithmetic didn't make sense, and yet their eyes followed every twitch of my shadow like I was holding the weather. The blind little guide shuffled out again, bumped into my knee, then turned and marched straight back inside, as if highlighting the problem for a slow student. He wasn't asking me to save him anymore. He was reminding me he had already done his part. For a helpless puppy, he made me feel very much like the one who was in over his head. "I can't just leave 5 of you here and pretend that that's a compromise," I muttered, hating how thin my own voice sounded. I called the rescue back and said I'd bring as many as I could fit, even if they had to scramble to find fosters later. Nobody cheered. There was only a weary, "do what you can," and a reminder about our outstanding vet balance that made my shoulders tighten. Trip by trip, I lifted warm, squirming bundles out of the log and lowered them into an old moving box lined with my jacket and the emergency blanket from my trunk. They whimpered and wriggled, then settled, filling the car with the smell of straw and milk and something older, like fear hanging in the air. The blind little guide was the last. He stood at the entrance until every sibling was gone, then finally let me scoop him up. As I shut the door on their soft rustling, it hit me that I had no plan past the next few miles of road. And still I turned the key. The heater in my car likes to take its time, so for a while the only warmth came from the box of puppies breathing against one another on the back seat. Every pothole sent a tiny wave of motion through them, bodies rolling and resettling, small noses bumping into fur for reassurance. One shivering puppy kept climbing the inside of the box, paws hooked over the cardboard edge, nose pointed toward the sound of my voice. At a red light, I reached back blindly and felt his face push into my palm, hot breath fogging my fingers, and the world outside the windshield felt strangely distant. I should have been thinking about logistics, about where 7 dogs were going to sleep, about what my landlord would say if he ever found out. Instead, I kept seeing that hollow log, replaying how quickly the woods went quiet after we drove away. Northwest Paws Rescue sits behind a strip mall. more converted storage unit than impressive facility, and the parking lot looked even smaller with my car full of consequences. I carried the box inside in 2 trips, the pups blinking at the harsh fluorescent lights, claws ticking on the metal exam table as they tried to huddle into one trembling knot. The blind little guide stayed tucked against my chest until the last possible second, heart racing under his ribs, head swiveling toward every new sound. Staff moved around us with tired efficiency, scanning for microchips that weren't there, weighing each pup, muttering numbers that all sounded lower than they should. Nobody called me a hero or made a speech. There was only the rustle of paperwork and the soft clank of kennel doors being prepared. When they finally lifted him from my arms to examine his eyes, his paws flexed in the air like he was still trying to walk us toward something I hadn't seen yet. The vet brought a penlight close, and he didn't even blink, just kept his face tilted toward the sound of her voice. I stumbled through the story, from the first broken cry near the trail to the straw-lined log that had no business existing in a city park. She'd seen worse, she said, but the set of her mouth tightened as she gently lifted each eyelid. Likely something he was born with, she murmured. Maybe shadows, maybe nothing at all. With surgery, there's a chance of improvement. Without it, he can still have a good life, if someone's willing to learn his language. That word willing landed heavier than I wanted it to. Around us, his brothers and sisters curled into the blankets in their kennels, small bodies already surrendering to the comfort of clean warmth. He kept stretching toward the front of his run, nose feeling for my sleeves, a soft whine slipping out whenever I stepped away. On the intake form, the tech paused at the blank space for name, and before I thought it through, I heard myself say, Marlo. The shelter puppy flicked his ears at the sound, as if he'd been waiting for that word. Then came the estimate for surgery, a number big enough to make my stomach dip, followed by the reminder that the rescue's medical fund was already thin. They talked about listing him as special needs, about hoping the right person might fall in love with a dog who would always see differently, and I nodded along, even though my chest felt tight. They chose a kennel at the end of the row for him, away from the draft by the back door, a small kindness that somehow made everything worse. Marlo paced the rubber mat in slow circles, nose tracing each corner as if he were memorizing the boundaries in case somebody moved them while he slept. When I crouched, his whole body leaned toward the sound of my joints cracking, head bumping the gate with a soft thud as he tried to get closer. Up close, he didn't look like a miracle or a symbol. He looked like a tired, fragile puppy who couldn't quite understand why the world kept changing its shape. The director stood beside me and walked through the realities again. Her voice gentle but clear. Too many animals, not enough money, the constant math of who gets what and when. We'll keep him safe, she said. We'll give him time. Sometimes that's the best we can do. I know that math. I've done it myself, and I hate it every single time. Before I left, I put my name down for an extra volunteer shift, promising to help clean kennels, walk whoever needed it, anything that felt like doing more than just worrying. I told myself that leaving him overnight in a warm place with food and meds was the responsible choice, better than dragging him home without a plan. But when the door shut behind me and one small, confused bark slipped through the crack before it closed, the word responsible felt a lot like cowardly. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, listening to the quiet parking lot and arguing with a part of myself that didn't seem interested in logic. By the end of the week, the smell of disinfectant and dry kibble had woven itself back into my clothes, which is usually a sign I'm at the rescue more than at home. The other pups from the log were already learning the rhythm of the place, yapping at feeding time, collapsing into tangled sleep after, their weight creeping up on the charts outside their runs. Marlo's weight climbed more slowly, his energy poured into listening rather than leaping, ears tuning to every footstep in the corridor. Whenever I walked past his kennel, that German Shepherd puppy turned his head toward my boots before I spoke, tail sweeping the floor in a small, steady arc. I tried to spread my time fairly, handing out walks and pats like even rations, but somehow I kept circling back to the dog who had already dragged me into the woods once. One afternoon, the director waved me into the cramped office lined with donation jars and construction paper thank you cards from kids. A local business had offered to cover part of the surgery, she said. No guarantees, but enough to shift it from impossible to maybe. There was still a gap, though, a stretch of cost and care that would have to come from somewhere less abstract. She didn't say my name, and that restraint felt louder than if she had. I stared at the estimate again, at the list of risks and aftercare steps, at the empty line waiting for a signature. My hand shook just enough to annoy me as I finally signed, feeling like I was forging the name of a braver person on my own paperwork. When I walked back to Marlo's kennel, he pressed his muzzle between the bars and breathed in my sleeve, and I had the ridiculous sense that he already knew something had changed. Surgery day arrived with no fanfare, just a note on the whiteboard and a circle around Marlo's name. I helped load him into the transport crate, my fingers clumsy on the latch, pretending not to notice how my throat tightened when he pawed at the plastic. In the waiting room at the specialty clinic, I filled out forms that cared more about payment methods than about who he was, and that mismatch rubbed at me. He went with the text without drama, giving my hand one quick lean and a soft huff that I decided to call trust, because the alternative hurt. Hours stretched thin, the television flickering silently, my coffee cooling untouched, while I reread the same paragraph in a brochure 3 times. When the surgeon finally appeared, mask hanging loose, her words were careful and measured. No miracles promised, just a cautious hope that some light might make it through. It wasn't a storybook fix. It was a maybe, and somehow that felt more honest. Back at Northwest Paws days later, after cones and medication and patient monitoring, a few of us gathered to see how he'd navigate whatever new world he had. They opened his kennel, and the hopeful puppy stepped out slowly, blinking, nose working overtime, paws placing themselves with careful intention. He didn't strut. He tested the ground like a person learning to walk again on a moving floor. Then I called his name from halfway down the corridor, and he paused, lifted his face, and walked toward me in a mostly straight line, tail rising with each step until his forehead touched my knee and stayed there. Fostering was the plan, at least the version I was willing to say out loud. There was a cramped, extra room in my duplex, a crooked fence around a patch of grass, and a mental list of reasons this arrangement should be temporary. Marlo explored it all at his own measured pace, nose first, new hints of vision helping him avoid the furniture he might once have collided with. He learned the house faster than I had, mapping the route from water bowl to back door to couch, with the quiet efficiency of someone who intended to remember every inch. While I answered emails for a job that never quite fit, he would curl against my foot, the solid weight of a loyal puppy who had already made up his mind about me. I told friends he was staying just until we find the right home, but the words felt thin, especially when he lifted his head at the sound of my voice coming through their phones. Updates on his brothers and sisters arrived in messages, photos of backyards, kids, clean beds that didn't smell like straw or cold wood. Each picture made me genuinely happy and a little wary, like joy was something that might run out if I grabbed too much. Marlo didn't bother with those calculations. He focused on figuring out where the sun hit the rug in the afternoon, which corner felt safest during thunderstorms, and how to nudge my hand off my screen when I'd been scrolling too long. Some nights I'd watch him breathe and feel fear curl quietly in my chest, not of him, but of what it would mean if I admitted he was home. He'd flick an ear in his sleep, as if he'd caught the thought, and somehow that made the choice both easier and heavier. I still think about the log when we walk, how ordinary that fallen tree looked until you knew what was curled inside its hollow center. Marlo trots beside me now with a little more confidence, still using scent and sound more than sight. But every so often he glances up as if checking that I haven't vanished. People ask why I stopped that day, why I followed a dog who couldn't see into the trees instead of leaving it to someone else. The honest answer is that I don't know. I was tired and busy and not in the mood for another long-term commitment. But this brave pup insisted that something more important than my schedule was waiting in the shadows. He didn't lead me toward comfort for himself. He guided me back to the family he refused to leave behind, And in the process, he dragged me into a bigger promise than I'd planned to make. Living with him hasn't been a neat line from crisis to victory. It's been messy, expensive, sometimes exhausting, full of quiet mornings and small, ordinary moments that matter more than any dramatic rescue scene. When I watch him tap his way around new spaces, trusting that I'll warn him about steps he can't see, I'm reminded that rescue isn't a single act. It's a long, steady decision to keep showing up, even on the days when you feel like you're not enough. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. If our story stays with you after the screen goes dark, let it nudge you toward whatever version of helping fits your life, whether that's volunteering, fostering, or simply sharing a dog who needs a home with someone who might listen. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.